You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
If you continue to believe that learning is a key factor in your development, you remain humble, grounded, because you accept that you don't know everything. Polycrisis, you have a decline in traditional development aid, and you have persistent systemic challenges, which is not merely a series of failures, but it's a symptoms of a deeper flow. We have that opportunity to look at the continent as a source of creativity and really an opportunity for us to think about prosperity with what we have. We have to create intergenerational conversation and give the opportunity for the next generation to share the table with us as equals.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to another episode of the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we explore the innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. Today's guest is Carl Manlan, who is a development practitioner and thought leader who has led transformational initiatives across Africa and emerging markets. From Vice President of Social Impact and Sustainability at Visa to Chief Operating Officer at Ecobank of Ecobank Foundation to senior roles at the UN and the Global Fund. He's also co-host of Inside the Blueprint, a podcast he hosts with his daughter, exploring the future of work, leadership, and purpose across generations. Carl, welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast. How are you?
I am very well, Tessa, and it's good to be here with you.
Fantastic. It's good to be here with you too. I know you've listened to the podcast before.
I did.
And as always, I like to start from the beginning. So please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Carl Manlan.
I like to introduce myself as a constant learner because I believe if you continue to believe that learning is a key factor in your development, you remain humble, grounded, because you accept that you don't know everything. I was born and raised in Côte d'Ivoire, in the city of Abidjan. And I left Abidjan in January 1998. And I can give you the exact date when I left because it was a very interesting moment in my own life. And 25th of January 1998, I was on Air Afrique flight. So for those on the continent that follow the continent, Air Afrique is a very important piece of the development of the continent and some of the challenges that we faced. And my destination was Harare, Zimbabwe. And in Harare, I focused on English. Then I went to university in South Africa, Cape Town. And then from the University of Cape Town, where I studied economics and finance, I started working in development space, which I now want to call the transformation space, around things like HIV, TB, and malaria, but most importantly, systems. And I think that's a key piece of all my learning in different sectors has been around system. So this is why I introduce myself as being a constant learner, because I hardly worked in the area where I studied. I studied economics and finance, and I started working in HIV, TB, and malaria. And then from there, I just sort of crisscrossed different organizations with a fundamental understanding that I have to be contributing to something which is larger than me. So this is a little bit of who I am, and I'm sure throughout the conversation, other elements will be revealed or clarified.
Fantastic. So if we look behind the journey, behind the thinking of constant learning, you've worked across global institutions, corporate boardrooms, grassroots ecosystems. So looking back, what moments would you say most clearly shaped your belief that real change happens when innovation, learning meets purpose?
It's a very good question. And I'll start from where I started in sort of the health scene. So early on in my career, when I was working on the transition from chloroquine to a combination therapy for the treatment of malaria, there was a Lancet article which accused the 2-year-old Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria to be funding a non-efficacious treatment for patients around the world. Primarily, chloroquine was no longer efficacious to treat malaria. The innovation, in this case, which is a better treatment, did not meet the purpose because of a funding gap. the combination therapy was 2.5 times more expensive than chloroquine. So here, we have the tools, but we cannot fulfill the purpose. Fast forward to that experience, 4 years later, while I'm working in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, I was confronted with a reality that treatment is not enough. So while we were visiting a hospital in Lubumbashi, there was an HIV patient who simply said to us that she was hungry. Our program was about providing access to treatment. There was no nutrition element in there. So in both instances, the innovation met the purpose, treatment. And in both cases, there was a missing element. Funding gap in one of them, nutrition in the other one. So you really need to get to a place where the innovation is meeting the purpose. And in the example that I've given you, it's about access to the full scope that makes the person better.
Thank you for sharing that. Through that, you've detailed 2 moments of crisis shaped your thinking. I know you've described Africa's current moment not as a crisis, but as an opportunity, what you call a Polytunity moment. For listeners hearing that term for the first time, what does it really mean in practical terms for Africa's economies?
So I have to give credit to Wan Hang, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins University. She's the one who came up with a concept. And I've decided to apply that concept to Africa. So if you look at what she thinks about, the sort of Africa's current polycrisis, because that's where it starts. Polytunity is the other side of polycrisis. So polycrisis, you have a decline in traditional development aid, and you have persistent systemic challenges, which is not merely a series of failures, but it's the symptoms of a deeper flow. Meaning, if we continue to apply this sort of linear mechanistic models to complex adaptive economies, which most African economies are, the white paper that I published called Africa Polytunity Moment, a core evolutionary tango, gives some elements around that, the idea that we have an opportunity with clear examples of how this has happened in the past to rethink that. So if you then take the concept of polytunity, Wan Hang argues that this moment of disruption should be viewed as an opportunity to adapt and apply the adaptive political economy framework. So if you think about it, adaptive, including moral political economy are the elements around this idea. So then for the adaptive place, it means that we need to be replacing this sort of machine thinking with system thinking with adaptation. And the sort of popular economy or let's say informal sector is a very interesting example of this adaptation. We also need to be thinking about, is it really a one-size-fits-all template that we can just look at every sort of situation and apply to it? And that's where the inclusivity comes in. We have to look at every situation and one way we can learn from it, we can adapt from it, and most importantly, what are the actors that are trying to solve this problem? And then the final one, from a moral perspective, we need to acknowledge that there are power asymmetries in life, and that's a reality. And how do we then find a way to make sure that new voices, different voices, have an opportunity to sort of demonstrate that development or transformation can be done differently? And that's really what this concept is about.
That idea of turning what looks like a crisis into opportunity shows up in your work, especially the work that you've done in financial inclusion and market systems. So let's take that idea to a level where a lot of Africans experience it day to day in terms of money, payments, and access. Because I know during your time at Visa and the Ecobank Foundation, there is a lot of focus in that area. But I was wondering, what did you learn about why access to digital payments is more than just convenience?
It is indeed more than just convenience. So when I was living in Accra, I enjoyed eating what they call coffee brokman, or like roasted plantain on the side of the road, which is sold with nuts. Or when I was living in Lomé, I enjoyed eating the millet porridge in the morning that was sold by this lady at the bottom of a block of flats where I used to live. And she would come every morning with her son. So digital payments provide an opportunity to secure all combinations of sales and transactions. So if a person comes and they don't have, let's say, cash, but they can use either mobile money or they can use another form of payment. Here is an opportunity for her to make sure that she doesn't lose the sale. And that's important because it changes the ability to interact with the consumer, the customer. But closing a sale is an important step on our own transformation journey. So the things that I learned from that is that we need to listen more to the pulse of the economy that is led by women. So how does digital financial services allow these women to make sure that she can continue to send her children to school, she can continue to provide food for the table? And then we also need to rethink about what entrepreneurship is about. Yes, technology is very powerful and there's a lot of skew towards tech entrepreneurs. But these two women are equally entrepreneurs because they control the supply chain. In the case of a lady that sells the plantain, grilled plantain on the side of the road, she needs a supplier that to provide that supply of plantains and peanuts if she doesn't have her own small holding farm. If we think about the other lady for the millet, she needs her own supply. So it's really thinking about collaboration with prosperity as a North Star. So what does prosperity mean for these two women? It doesn't necessarily mean that they need to have a Bentley or need to have all these things. But prosperity means that they have enough, and maybe a little bit more, to put food on the table and to make sure that the children can actually go to school. And I loved the Lome example. This young boy, every single morning, will come with his mom, stay for about an hour, then he will go to school. But imagine the power of that child seeing his mother, an entrepreneur, making money, and the impact that this has on his own idea of what he can do in society.
Thank you for sharing that. I liked what you said in terms of listening to the pulse of the economy, because I know many financial inclusion initiatives struggle to scale. From your experience, what would you say separates projects that transform economies from those that stay stuck at the pilot stage?
Yeah, I think the feedback loop with the consumer is critical. And I think of there is a fintech in Abidjan that has now more than 1.1 million users, active users. And they just got a new microfinance license, which means that they'll be adding new services. What they've solved as a problem is the ability to open a bank account without going into a financial institution. So the brick and mortar piece is no longer there. And a very, very powerful customer service to the point where the CEO or the co-founder will be doing customer service related elements. He will be on social media. He will be in the WhatsApp if you send him a WhatsApp to make sure that the problem is resolved. So the ability to change a digital experience into human experience is key. And the second element is that the solution has to be in response to a real pain point on the trajectory of people's prosperity. So let me give you the example of interoperability. You probably remember the first time you sent an SMS from the country where you used to live to another country. That was many moons ago. But the power of the interoperability from an SMS perspective meant that for some of us that were foreign students in other countries, it dramatically reduced the cost of connecting with our parents back home. I no longer had to go by the payphone or buy somebody's cards to be able to make the call. But I was able to send that SMS. Imagine the same in terms of interoperability in the payment landscape, where I can send that money across. It's the same unit of currency, and mobile money has sort of demonstrated that this is possible. So I think that, to me, in terms of the ability to have really a customer focus and understanding which problem you're trying to solve for the individuals, are critical for these projects to take off and really transform the way we interact in society.
You highlighted the company in Abidjan that has provided the ability to open bank accounts with minimum friction and has over 1 million users. I know you mention often that the goal isn't inclusion itself, but trust and behavioral change, which this highlights. But what does that actually look like for households and small businesses on the continent?
Very good one. So I have a bias, of course, in health because my father was a medical doctor, my mother was a nurse, and my first 10 years of my career were in health. So when I started working in HIV, TB, and malaria, communities needed to trust that, for example, the mosquito net or bed net, we protect them from malaria. And not having a mosquito net was a higher risk of contracting malaria. So the prevention tools, such as abstinence or condom, for example, meant that you could avert an infection, but you trusted that if you choose one of these methods, you will not contract one of these sexually transmitted diseases. Then if you think about the challenge, then it was not about the tools, but creating the conditions for people to believe in a better tomorrow if they applied these elements, sleeping under a mosquito net and using preventive methods. If we take another example in 2016, when India decided to demonetize, many bank accounts had been open. But the inclusion through the indicator of a bank account, even though it was achieved, revealed another problem. They were not being used. So the knowledge and the tools to make the most might have been missing. And those early missteps in India, which were corrected, brought trust and behavior change, which became part and parcel of the success of what followed. So then you think about a household. It means speaking about money and not shy away from the impact it has in day-to-day lives. So financial education must start at home. And thinking about the woman selling porridge on the side of the road in Lome that I mentioned earlier, a son was with a mother before going to school, and he learned about customer service, money management, entrepreneurship. The challenge that we have is that we don't really know how to document these experiences, which are familiar to all Africans across the continent. But this is probably the foundation of entrepreneurship of many Africans around the world. For the small business, the key behavior change is about thinking market access. As market access, more than anything, determines the scale of investment that you're requiring for growth. There's a lot of focus, of course, on access to finance. But I think without market access, the need for capital and investment is a difficult ask. So these, to me, are opportunities for us to really think about what this means for small businesses and households and how do we support them.
You mentioned there in terms of entrepreneurship and market access, which brings me to a topic that I know you feel strongly about, which is entrepreneurship in the informal economy. You often push back in terms of Africa's informal sector being a problem that needs to be fixed. Why do you see the informal sector as one of Africa's greatest assets?
Because they're creative, they're innovators, they are change makers. I strongly believe that if we are able to work with the Africa we have, and the economic actors we have operate is what is labeled the informal sector or popular economy, but it's not a failure of formality. There's a complex system with, of course, high transaction costs and institutional gaps. But the reality is that mobile money adapted to human behavior and the democratization of mobile access and people exchanging units on the phone became a proxy for exchanging money. Let's take another example, which is about, again, behavior change and money exchange. Across the continent, you have Stockwells, Pamoja, Susu. So depending on where you find yourself, there's a different name. But it's basically a collective way of raising capital and making sure that you have what you need to be able. So these indigenous institutions, they're not in opposition to real banking platforms or real banking per se. They are in their own right financial assets, financial technologies without the sort of apps that are built on trust and behavior change. And anyone in the app business need people to trust the app and continue to use it. Therefore, the behavior is changing. So if we look at this, we should think of them as being worthy of integration rather than replacement. And that's why I think that if we observe the Africa we have deeply, we have a lot of these solutions that exist because people have found a way to work with what they have. And that, to me, that's the power of the asset that we have in the informal sector of the popular economy.
If we keep to the theme of the informal economy, we know that entrepreneurs operating in that environment operate in a high friction environment, sometimes weak infrastructure, limited access to capital. What strategies have you seen in the informal sector that you think global businesses can probably adopt or learn from?
I mean, the most underestimated strategy to me is using what you have, not what you want.
Yes.
So these entrepreneurs in high friction environments can innovate with what they lack, meaning capital, infrastructure, formal institutions. Their response to this is to creatively repurpose existing resources, their practices, and knowledge that the wealthy dismiss as backward. So it's not that they are being scrappy. It is a very sophisticated adaptive innovation that sort of co-evolves. What I like to know, you think about it as a tango. When you're doing a tango, you need to co-evolve with your partner. You need to sort of think of what are the local conditions, what is the tune exactly. Now, think about Nollywood. Nollywood became a $1 billion industry without the infrastructure of Hollywood. It did not copy sort of your Western blueprints. They were experimenting, adapting, and building markets through what many people look at this as being weak institution. But they worked with what they had, which is an immense talent of young people that are becoming now visible faces of a creative industry of Nigeria. The other one that we also sometimes miss is grassroots innovation capacity. Okay, most development will start with very modest form of innovation among people that are looking at the situation that they want to change. But we always think about and obsess with external investment, replicating first world best practices, and thinking about the history in which we find ourselves. And you think about climate resilient agriculture, which is a very important topic today. These are practices that existed on the African continent. So these are not new things. It's just that the intersection of technology and change and what we think is better has not necessarily elevated the practices that we have on the continent. And we have that opportunity to look at the continent as a source of creativity and really an opportunity for us to think about prosperity with what we have.
I think it's safe to say that a lot of this adaptation and creativity in terms of how informal sector businesses operate are done through necessity. If there's policymakers out there listening, what would you say needs to change in how regulation, finance, or taxation are designed to support the MSMEs operating in the informal economy?
So if we agree that development is not a linear exercise, and that development is the opportunity to look at the sort of institution and the capacity that you have and say, how do we make this work? So it may not necessarily look perfect. It may not necessarily look like what we see with proper institutions and sort of, but if you think about M-Pesa, the regulators looked at this and sort of allowed it to happen. Then they designed the elements around regulation, finance, and taxation. Every single person, even in the informal sector, pays some form of tax. They may not be paying tax on the income that they generate or the revenues that they make, but they're paying municipal tax. They're paying VAT and so on and so forth. So we reduce the conversation around systems to the fact that they are not regulated, they don't pay taxes, but actually they do. So the question then becomes for these policymakers, how do you support meta institutions? And we'll come to what we look at meta institutions. So meta institutions, those are systems that will enable the discovery of solution. They don't necessarily decide what the outcome is going to be, but they're going to support experimentation, protect the changes that are going to happen, and then be catalysts for learning. So that's how you sort of turn those high frictions environment into high potential. And we have some examples on the continent. If you think about the emergence of mobile money, that was a response to the fact that there was an opportunity to create value out of something that we already had. which was basically large investment by the likes of Mo Ibrahim in the telecoms and others that created those platforms. So we were able to leapfrog and say, okay, now that we have this in the hands of, let's say, 700 million plus Africans, what is the next level on it? But if the policymakers have stopped this element, then we would have found and say, well, we're trying to sort of play catch up on things that evolve naturally based on the behavior of individuals and people understanding that there were opportunities that were there.
You noted the M-Pesa model and the meta-institution idea.
Yep.
From examples like mobile money, agency banking, or instant payment systems, what lessons would you say African governments should take from that when building economic infrastructure?
So there's an interesting case study. When I was at Ecobank between 2016 and 2021, Ecobank introduced cash express accounts and cash express, which is basically leveraging the infrastructure of a telephone number for somebody to be able to start the journey on the financial system on one hand. On the other hand, leveraging the network of small businesses across different African cities and rural areas for these to become points of access to financial resources. But this only happened because central bankers in Ghana allowed the regulation to evolve to allow this to happen, meaning agency banking. So these institutions that are often criticized as not being functioning, they're actually smart individuals working in them who are trying to find a solution for some of the problems that they see to create more value in the economy. So if we leave the African continent and go to Brazil, we know that Latin America has long struggled with financial inclusion and market concentration. But recent regulation in Brazil have demonstrated the impact of adaptive governance in action. So Brazil Pix, which is an instant payment system, is not a private fintech innovation. It's a public infrastructure led by the Central Bank of Brazil, and which is working as a meta-institution to enable any individuals in the country to be able to access instant payments. So here we see that in the case of M-Pesa, it was private actors that sort of made that opportunity. In the case of Brazil and the case of Ghana, it was actually the central bank, which is a government entity. And if we start to look at these examples across the continent, we'll find ourselves in a position where we will love the idea and the power that this brings into our ability to look at our own countries differently and the people that are actually work in these institutions.
What you discussed there in terms of the balance between public rules and private innovation takes us into your work inside corporations, because when businesses get this right, impact and profitability don't have to be such opposites.
Correct.
You've worked at the heart of large organizations trying to align profit with purpose. In an Africa context, what would you say purpose-driven business looks like when it's actually working?
You know what? I'll give you the example of a soap that you might be familiar with, Lifebuoy. So if you look at the early 2000s, Unilever faced a very common corporate challenge. Do we continue to run this product in a market that there are many soaps? Or do we actually rethink what this soap is about? Today, Lifebuoy is $1 billion business. They understood that they were not selling soap. They were selling a behavior change, which is hand washing that saves children's lives. So that transformation of understanding that what I have in my hand, if it's done well, I can solve for another problem, given that child mortality, especially under 5, is quite high on the continent. It wasn't about philanthropy or trying to make anybody look happy and take pictures and so on. No, it was a strategic finance decision. It was a strategic marketing decision. And these two combined turned into a social impact outcome. So the ability to bring health education into a rural distribution channel and look at public health outcomes into measurable KPIs, so key performance indicators, you start to realize that you can actually have profit and purpose into the same bag. They are not opposite. If you really look at that example, it's a multiplier effect. Because suddenly you had mothers who saw that the soap was an integral part of protecting the children. The social impact component became a market differentiation for Unilever. So from that example, it's really about building trust and changing behavior. And then the critical insight here for me, from that example, is that it wasn't about looking at it from a perspective of a foreign distribution model. You look at how communities were actually engaging, and then you start to build with existing trust networks, working with local retailers, indigenous health practices, and so on and so forth. Because, again, they understood that this market in which they're operating adapts. You cannot just come in with your soap and expect that you're going to extract predictable returns. You have to really think about it. So if you think of the African context, purpose-driven means that you can put impact, purpose in the same bag and make an impact in transforming something that maybe was not the first intention because everybody sells soap. But that really differentiated. And I think for me, it's one of the best examples of how a product that was not designed for that became really an opportunity for mothers to see that there's value for the children themselves.
You gave the great example of Lifebuoy soap and its purpose-driven approach, which requires a long-term thinking strategy or mindset. And that naturally brings us to, I guess, the leadership legacy and how ideas and businesses are passed from one generation to the next. I know that you co-host Insider Blueprints with your daughter, which is a great thing.
Thank you.
How has that experience reshaped your view of leadership and the future of work?
Wow. First is that I saw in my daughter a partner. So we are co-hosting the podcast. And it was born out of the idea that we have to create intergenerational conversation and give, as parents or as educators or elders, the opportunity for the next generation to share the table with us as equals. And I remember the team working with me came back and said, okay, well, we need now to release. What do we put under your name and what do we put under your name? I said, well, you're not putting any of the things that I've done in my life. It has to be co-host because she has to feel part of something that she's co-creating with her father. And to me, the most powerful element has to do with transmission. And if you go to the etymology of the word transmission, it means to give a mission. So this generation, our generation, Tessa and I, what is the mission that we're giving to the next generation?
Yes.
And it cannot be something where we sit back, we wait when we are old, fragile, and we now tell to them, okay, this is my testament and these are the things that you want to do. No. Children learn by observing and doing with us. The values are transmitted not by us telling them that you need to be humble, you need to be strategic, you need to be, and so on and so forth. No, they see it and they have to resonate. Okay, my father said he needs to be humble, but the way he behaves, it really has nothing to do with that. That's the power.
Yes.
So sitting with my daughter and looking at her evolving from episode 1 to episode 12, we didn't do any training or something. No, I wanted to see the evolution. And over time, she started to become more comfortable. She started doing her own research. She started looking for which questions she should ask to the guest. And I was very pleased to see that. So in terms of the future of work, well, the future of work is what you create. And the creative aspects of the next generation is very much in line with the creative aspects of the informal sector of the popular economy. You have individuals that look at the situation and say, you know what, I'm going to do it. I remember growing up in Abidjan. There were women that would come every single day, knock on the door and ask for plastic bottles. So long before recycling was sexy, these women were doing it. Or in our neighborhood, there was a failure in terms of collection of rubbish. Next thing I see, a couple of young people walking around, pushing a cart and collecting rubbish and go and deposit it in Aquedo, which was used to be the place where they go and dump the rubbish. Anyway, it doesn't come to me. But you see what I'm talking about.
Yes.
And that is a power. And I wanted to make sure that while I'm alive, I start to work with my daughter so that she sees for herself what I can pass on to her and not wait for me to be old and fragile.
Fantastic. So if we zoom out but keep on the theme of intergenerational, I know from my work, as well from your work and experience across Africa, many businesses struggle with succession planning. Mm-hmm. Why would you say passing on leadership is often harder than building the business itself, specifically in Africa?
When I lived in Ghana, there was an article, that was back in 2016, there was an article in the BFNT that said that the average age of cocoa farmers was 60 then, and the children were not interested. Or we can think about the Nana Bens in Togo, and we send the children to study around the world, and they're also not interested. In these two examples, you can see that the idea of success from one generation to the next evolves. And we miss the opportunity to make the children understand that the reason why you're able to go and study in all these different places is because this business made it possible.
Yes.
And for the next generation, meaning your children, to benefit from the same, we have to make sure that we continue, because this business is allowing more people from your country, from your region, from your continent to aspire for something bigger. And that is a challenge often. The challenge is connected to the fact that this intergeneration and the transmission of what the mission is. So if for the child whose mother was a Nana Benz in Togo, and for those who don't know the Nana Benz, they got the nickname because they were so wealthy that they were only driving Mercedes-Benz. Therefore, they got this nickname of Nana Benz. The transmission of what success looks like became different. The transmission of what you should contribute to society became different. But these women, in their own right, believe that the best thing to do is to provide these children with the best education possible in the world. I am not sure they anticipated that the best education in the world will mean that the children are not coming back. Or if you think about Kenya, the third generation of Indians that left and go and study in the UK or Canada, most of them did not come back. So they sold the properties of the second generation that way. So you sort of find yourself in a position where the idea of transmission is not necessarily discussed, because often we are scared of our own death. Therefore, we don't speak about transmission, because when you start to speak about this thing, it's almost as if you are talking about you no longer be around. And as Africans, maybe other people as well, we are not very comfortable talking about death. But if you're not willing to speak about the fact that you will no longer be around, how comfortable will you be to actually pass on? You probably hold on to it for too long. And by the time you want to pass it on, well, the interests are no longer aligned, and you sort of maybe lose that opportunity. So I think there is an opportunity to think about, when do we start the intergenerational transfer of competencies? And some of them are passed on based on early engagement. My daughter is 13, but the things that I'm able to pass on to her, and also a brother can see early enough, is shaping the way she is and what she wants to become.
From your experience, would you say things are slightly changing in terms of the cultural acceptance or awareness of the need for intergenerational handover, succession planning when it comes to family businesses?
It is changing. I mean, there is more and more conversation around family businesses on the continent. And I think the first family business in Africa, probably anywhere else in the world, is a farm. So how are we able to look at, let's say, a cocoa farm plantation, which may no longer produce cocoa beans, as an asset that can be leased or transformed? If you look at Stellenbosch today, a lot of the wine farms are turning some of their estate into real estate, into real estate development. So suddenly, well, I no longer want to produce wine, or maybe not that much, or these vineyards are too old, I don't want to sort of restart. Therefore, I'm going to transform this space into real estate. So it's that ability to rethink, how do you generate income if farming is not what you want to do, but how do you then use and leverage that asset? Do you just sell it off and move it? Or you say, you know what? What's the opportunity for me to lease that asset so that somebody can build something here and I continue to get an income from it? The same way as my father or my grandfather was getting income from selling, for harvesting cocoa beans and so on and so forth. And I think that's where the opportunity is. And I think that is changing on the continent. It is changing because we realize that we have many family businesses that we don't call necessarily family businesses, but they are.
As we come to the end of today's conversation, which has been a fantastic conversation, looking to the future, 10 years from now, what would make you say the work that you've done across finance, policy, and leadership has genuinely shifted outcomes for Africa's next generation?
This is a very, very tough question. And I'll tell you why. I believe I'm a very small contributor into something which is much larger. And whatever I'm doing is because other people believe in it and make it happen. When I was in Ecobank, our ability to leverage the bank platform to speak about non-communicable diseases is because many people believe that this was possible. So the success will be that at minimum, my own children live a life based on values that allow them to live in a world where regardless of the hardship, they still believe that prosperity is possible. And their contribution has to always be based on the values that I was able to pass on to them. That to me will be enough. Beyond that, it's out of my control. But the importance of making sure that I am consistent in what I do while I'm alive, and that 5 or 10 years from now, if I'm still around, I can look back and say, this small business that was focused only on their small geographic area has now expanded to 1, 2, 3, 4 markets, or actually serving the 1.4 billion people across the African continent. That would have been a small contribution to something that they did themselves. So I am an instrument in somebody's orchestra. And that is, to me, my definition of success, that I've been able to be an instrument in someone's orchestra.
And if we zoom out, 10 years from now, what does Africa getting it right actually look like to you?
Is we have used everything that we have to enable prosperity. That's really the opportunity that we have in front of us.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
The one that I always say to myself is that, Carl, it is not about you. You are serving a bigger purpose. That's it. It is not about you.
Fantastic. I love that. And I guess that's in keeping with one of the key themes from today in terms of succession, intergenerational, setting up the foundations for the next generation. It's not about us, it's about the wider community and the people who follow after us. Carl, there has been a fantastic conversation, very rich conversation, from financial inclusion to entrepreneurship, leadership, and the future of African economies. I think the message that stands out today for me is that Africa's future won't be imported. It will be designed, adapted, and built by Africans who understand their local context and their local needs. So thank you for taking the time to join us today.
A pleasure and a privilege, Tessa. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.